I mean, data breaches at small organizations can be costly. How costly can they be? Oh, just to give you guys some background on me, I'm a partner here at Mullen Coughlin. We are in privacy attorneys. We are incident response attorneys. It's almost all what we do is handle incidents that people suffer. Last year we handled about 3,800 incidents, and just as an example, today we're going to talk about ransomware. That was about a third of our incidents, so it's happening every day to organizations of every size. It isn't just big targets out there that attract bad guys. They are looking for any way into anywhere they can get, and once they're in, they're looking to do as much damage as they can to get paid as much as they can. So I guess the first thing to point out is that data breaches, to me as a lawyer, are a legal event. It's obvious. It's an IT event. It's a business event. There are many aspects to a data breach, but right at the beginning, we like to make sure people understand it's a legal event. A data breach is something that's defined differently by 50 different state statutes. It's defined in HIPAA. It's defined in various regulations out there. Obviously, the DoD has defined a data breach. So when somebody has some sort of event, we don't like to even call it a breach until we figure it out. So that's why you get connected to a lawyer right out of the gate, because we don't want to start talking about breaches and notifications and all the things that may follow unless we have to. And so we're the ones that come in and make sure we're taking our careful steps as we proceed. So legal costs obviously are involved in an incident response. The very next thing we bring in is forensics. Absolutely need to know how it happened, make sure we contain an event. And in a ransomware incident, you're going to have to start figuring out how to get your business back. So we bring in forensic experts that can help us gather evidence, analyze that evidence, make sure things are contained, make sure we're keeping the data safe again, and helping restore systems. So there's forensics and legal costs right out of the gate. With a ransomware event, you're shut down. And so you will have clients asking you for information. What's the story? When am I going to get my services? You're going to have to start talking to third parties about the situation. So a lot of times we work with public relations experts to help us with that messaging. And so now we're working on three fronts. We're analyzing the information for legal issues. We're working with the technical experts to fix things and get things back up and running. And we are talking with our clients and possibly the media if it's big enough. As an example, I had a client, a small MSP, had about 12 clients, but the MSP was hacked, and then from their platform they ransomwared 6 of their clients. So half of their clients are immediately affected, and their own company has to shut things down in order to start to mitigate the damage. So all of their clients are wondering what's going on, and we don't have answers yet. So it's a really tough moment. That's why the public relations experts can be helpful, is we want to say as much as we can to convey where we understand what we need to do, and we're going to fix things, we're going to make things right. But we don't want to say too much. We don't want to start admitting, we're going to give you credit monitoring or something like that. We have to figure out what's needed and what happened before we know how best to respond. So it's really tricky. So now we have our public relations going, our forensics going, and down the road with this client, we realized that one of their clients was a HIPAA covered entity, and they had thousands of patients' information that was affected. So we now found out that we had to do notice. So there's notice costs. There are costs related to the printing and the mailing of the notice letters. You have to stand up a call center to make sure that when all these letters go out, you have somebody there to answer questions that they're going to have. And then credit monitoring, required in a few states, but always recommended when social security numbers are exposed. We had to provide that access to those folks. So the costs continue to mount. And at this point, we have notice out the door telling the world about this event. So what that led to was regulatory inquiries. We had to report it to HHS, and they were asking questions obviously about security generally, and then about the event and what happened, and launched a formal investigation against my client. So now we're back into, legal costs for defending the client through a regulatory investigation. And then at the end, we had one of the clients sue my client because they had their own business interruption costs on their end when the ransomware hit. And so we now had to fight with them, our own client, about what costs they might need reimbursed. So it's a huge event. And just to throw some numbers at you, I just looked at a bunch of our matters, and just to give you a general sense, you have legal costs always $15,000 to $30,000. I mean, we have matters where they're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the very least on an incident response, you're looking at 15 to 30 for legal. Forensics, 50,000 happens. Usually they're more, but I'd say 150,000 is probably a good average or higher average number. So 50 to 150,000 in forensics. Notice costs, they really range depending on how many people, but you can expect $5,000 for maybe 15,000 people at least. Then there's credit monitoring. You pay per enrollment for folks there. That's going to be another 5,000 to 15,000. Again, it's wide range. I've done $2 million notifications with millions of people affected. So it really does depend on how many people there. But your public relations assistance throughout was about $20,000. Regulatory investigation, the legal costs there are 10 to 20,000. Depends on how many regulators and how long it takes. And then litigation, this was resolved pretty quickly, and litigation was dismissed fairly quickly. But in most cases in these events, when litigation arises, you're talking $75,000 to defend it. And then there could be a settlement. So those charges as well. And we haven't even talked about the ransom. The client did need to pay ransom. The average ransom last year was about $250,000. And that is regardless of size of client. The demands come in and you negotiate with these guys. And if you have to pay, you end up paying a pretty large amount in most cases. They've gotten pretty tough, and you can't get them too much lower than that. So, it's $500,000 plus just about any event that occurs.
I would imagine, right, that not many of the folks listening to this call have a budgeted line item for $500,000 of potential cyber incident costs, right? That's why we buy insurance. It's that risk transfer. It's transferring the risk off of our balance sheet for exactly the things that Chris talked about. So first, let's kind of do an overview. And Chris, your examples were perfect because it's going to tie right into how the coverage would respond. So let's talk kind of cyber insurance 101. What does the coverage actually provide to you? What am I buying? What am I getting? So much of what Chris talked about first and foremost is and I group it into kind of 4 buckets. So it falls into bucket number 1, which is incident response. So if you look at cyber incidents in terms of frequency, meaning how often they happen, versus severity, meaning how costly they are, the most frequent dollars being paid out for a cyber incident are in that incident response piece. It's paying for a Chris from a Mullen Coughlin to come in and help you through that incident. It's paying for the IT forensics firms to come in and do their triage and their investigation. It's paying for the public relations in the event you do have a PR related event. It's paying for the notification and the credit monitoring. All of that is part of incident response within a cyber insurance policy. The next piece that Chris mentioned is around regulatory investigations and lawsuits. If you were then the victim of some kind of class action or any just direct lawsuit, an individual lawsuit related to a cyber incident, or a regulatory investigation. I know we've got folks with CMMC compliance, the government comes in. We've got HIPAA, PCI, the various privacy laws by state. If any of those folks come in and conduct an investigation, you're going to need defense and you're going to incur costs, and you may even suffer some fines and penalties. All of those fall into what I call the lawsuit and regulatory investigation bucket. So that's bucket number 2. If you're following the theme here, Chris and his team are not cheap, and we want to make sure we've got their services covered. So that's what the insurance is going to take care of for us. Bucket number 3, cyber crime. So Chris touched on this there towards the end. Who pays for that extortion, the extortion demand, the actual ransom that you may have to pay? Now, oftentimes when I have these discussions, there's always somebody in the audience who's, I would never pay a ransom. I don't negotiate with terrorists. And unfortunately, no one wakes up in the morning and says, God, I'd really love to pay a ransom today. That's the reality, right? But far too often, businesses are finding themselves in a very compromised position, either because they don't have adequate backups that they can fail over to, or perhaps they do, but the hackers are still threatening to disclose everything that they've seen in your system on the dark web. And so many organizations are still paying that ransom, not to restore or get their data back, but for that promise not to disclose. Don't release everything I have. So the extortion demand is part of cyber insurance. Now, this is a big area of discussion. It's big in terms of the government and regulatory, whether or not we're going to continue to allow ransoms to be paid, but also especially in the insurance world, how insurance is responding to that. And I'll come back to that in a second. Another nuance of the cybercrime piece is social engineering. I would tell you across JKJ's client experience, that is the most frequent claim or incident that we have, is a business being socially engineered. Most commonly, it's in the form of one of their vendors says they've changed where you need to send payment, and then they start sending payment to somebody who is not who they said they were. I've had multiple $1 million of losses for clients in this space. It's really, really unfortunate. Then bucket number 4. So we had incident response, we had regulatory investigations and legal, cyber crime, and then bucket number 4, we're in business losses. And this is actually another piece Chris mentioned. In the case of that managed service provider, their clients came after them for their own business interruption, their downtime as a result of the cyber attack. And I'll come back to this example a few times because it really plays nicely into some of the coverage nuances that are important. If you were that organization that was impacted by that managed service provider going down, you would want to have business interruption coverage for yourself. That's going to cover your revenue loss and your extra expenses during that time. Very comparable. And Robert, I love when you use the analogy to fire insurance, right? Property insurance. Cyber insurance is extremely analogous to property. And if you think to business interruption or business income loss, you have it on both a property policy and a cyber policy. The difference is what triggered the loss. Was it a flood, a fire, an earthquake, or was it a cyber event? So if your business is highly dependent on your uptime, especially in the case of manufacturers or healthcare, and your ability to provide care to individuals, business interruption is a significant exposure for you. Some folks in the professional service space, it may or may not, a day or two of downtime may or may not crush your business. But these are things you need to consider in terms of how you structure coverage. And then there's another nuance within business interruption, something called reputational harm. Business interruption only covers that period of time while you're down, right? Be it 1 day, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, whatever it is. When you're back up and running, what is the impact on your business going forward? Did you take a beating in the press for the incident? Did you lose customers as a result? Did they say, hey, sorry, I needed your product or service. You weren't able to provide it. I went elsewhere and I'm good now. So I'm not coming back. I'm glad you're okay, but I'm not coming back. I'm good. So if you continue to suffer revenue loss as a result of a cyber attack, even after you're back up and running, there's actually coverage designed for that in your cyber insurance policy. So it really covers a wide range of things, and all of it are so critical to overall incident response. I like to make the joke that cyber insurance is really the Ghostbusters of cyber incidents. Who are you going to call? Call your cyber insurance carrier. They are the ones that are going to bring a Chris into their room, who's then going to guide everything you do, and they're going to do it under the guise of attorney-client privilege, which is also critically important in the event you have some kind of investigation. So a lot of components to cyber insurance there. Now let's talk about the problems and the pressures, right? Yeah. So when you think about cyber insurance and all the things that I said it covers, as you can imagine, there's been a lot more pressure in terms of a lot more incidents happening over the last several years. 4 or 5 years ago, we weren't seeing the type of claims and number of incidents that we see today. As you can imagine, with the migration of the workforce to remote working during the pandemic, you had a lot of vulnerabilities exposed. People working on home computers to connect, just scrambling to survive. Laxed protocols. I mean, I know folks that got rid of their password changing policy for a period of time just because they're like, all right, we've got too much to deal with. Let's just make things easier for everybody. Insecure network connectivity, open ports and remote ports and things. So all of those things were exploited, and we saw this huge expansion of the number of ransomware attacks. Well, what that means is that insurance companies were no longer as profitable. Insurance likes to pretend we're super altruistic, and they are, right? They're there to indemnify you, bring you back to where you were before an incident. But at the end of the day, insurance companies are in the business to make money. So when we start to infringe upon their margins, and we're making a ton of money on cyber insurance, now they're going, oh crap. How do we make sure that we aren't vulnerable? We're offering all these limits for these people. How do we make sure that we're not going to get go belly up as a result? So when we think about specifically ransomware attacks, right? You're seeing a lot of pressure on the extortion coverage, the ransom payment coverage in the insurance world. A lot of the organizations in the insurance world are starting to pull back from how they offer that coverage. It used to be just an off the shelf policy, whatever policy limit you were buying, traditionally speaking, your ransomware limit was going to be the same as that limit. Was it 1 million? Was it 5 million? You were likely going to get the extortion coverage to that limit. And those days are coming to an end. You're starting to see them pull back and put sublimits. So whereas you may have gotten $1 million before, now you could only get 500,000. You're starting to see them put significant deductibles. So where you may have only had a $10,000 deductible, now it's 100,000. Or you're seeing things like co-insurance. So they'll put a clause on there that says, hey, you've got $1 million of ransomware coverage, but there's 50% co-insurance, which means whatever we pay, you pay half. So they're forcing more skin in the game from insureds. The other thing that you're going to start seeing now is a lot of pressure on underwriting scrutiny. So we used to be able to buy cyber insurance, giving the insurance carriers extremely limited information about a company. I could type into a portal, company name, address, total revenue, maybe ballpark number of records that they hold. That's about it, their website. And I could get a quote. That's all they needed to know. That they didn't ask a thing about the cybersecurity posture of that organization. Those days are now gone. They've gotten a lot smarter very quickly and said, all right, what are the things that we need to look at to make sure that an individual company is more or less secure than the company next door? And that's going to dictate the types of terms we give them and the rates. So let's kind of maybe talk about a couple of those things. So, and we've got a number of MSPs on the call here who are going to be able to speak to how you would accomplish these, but they're getting brought into these insurance conversations all the time. And here's why. Multi-factor authentication. We all know what this is now. You log into your bank account and it sends you a text, right? We're seeing it in our personal lives and we're certainly seeing it in our professional lives now. So when I say multi-factor authentication, the question back to me should be, okay, Alexandra, we get it, but where? Where am I supposed to have it? And there are 4 key areas that you need to have multi-factor authentication to be insurable today. Number 1, email access. It was interesting. I had a conversation with a client a couple of days ago who said, well, how does having MFA on email stop a ransomware attack? I've got all these great filters and it's not going to stop anybody from clicking on something that they shouldn't. I said, well, you're exactly right. That is not what multi-factor authentication is for. In this case, it's to prevent business email compromise. Somebody getting into your emails. And again, if that happened, and I've seen this where we start getting the spam emails from somebody at one of our clients, we're like, uh-oh, something's wrong. They're sending us a bunch of funky emails. This doesn't look right. IT starts to investigate and they realize, oh crap, somebody got into this person. They hacked into this person's email. While having MFA would have likely prevented the majority of those incidents. And when we have those, then we got to call Chris. Chris has got to bring in forensics, and they have to figure out what was in that person's email that could have been compromised. And now we've got to figure out what our regulatory obligations are. So it's not all just ransomware, right? There's a lot more to it. So I said emails number one. Area number two, remote access. I mentioned the remote workforce. We want to make sure their access is locked down. And of course, your hackers are likely not sitting in your building. So we want to make sure their ability to get into your network is secured and prevented through multi-factor authentication being required. Area number three, if you have a managed service provider that's handling your IT, or if you're doing it in-house, all of their access to your systems, which is called privileged access or administrator rights, the ability to make changes and things, needs to be locked down with multi-factor authentication. Area number four, that kind of falls into area number three, is access to your backups. We want to make sure our backup files are super secure because, again, we do want to try to avoid having to pay a ransom. So we want to have really, really good backups. Speaking of backups, backups need to be separate from our network. Far too often historically, when folks were suffering a ransomware attack, they encrypted the network and then also encrypted the backups because they were in the same place. So you often ransoms had to be paid because they had no other choice. Their own backups were encrypted. So insurance companies now are going to ask if you have a truly air-gapped backup copy that is separate from your network, whether in a cloud solution or stored offline. They are going to run a scan of your network, and they're going to see if you've got open ports, open remote desktop protocol, and other such things. They're going to ask if you do any kind of employee training. You know, how much emphasis do you put on actually securing your network from the people that are responsible for it, right? People are the gateways to your network. You know, just the same way as you ideally don't want employees just opening the door to any old guest to come into your building, same for your network. So what kind of skepticism do we try to promote and security culture do we promote within our employee base? Incident response planning, actually thinking through what would we do if we were under attack? How would that look like? Who would be involved in the decisions? Who would we communicate with? How would we communicate with our clients? How would we communicate internally? And flushing those things out. There's a lot of technology pieces that they're going to ask about today, right? Cyber can be managed by people, process, and technology. So people, like our employee training, right? Processes, making sure we've got incident response policies, dual authorization for financial transfers and the like. But technology speaking, I'm going to throw out a bunch of alphabet soup here, but EDR, endpoint detection and response, EPP, endpoint protection, IDS, intrusion detection systems, next generation antivirus software, the list goes on. They're also going to ask about patch management. A really good example of this was Equifax from the 2017 breach that all of us were part of, unfortunately. They had an unpatched piece of software. The fix was out there. They just didn't apply it. And so it left a gaping hole open for the bad guys to get in. Another good example is if you followed the news in the last few months, that Log4j, Log4Shell vulnerability. Every insurance company is going to ask now, hey, did you patch it everywhere you knew you had to? That was really, really big. We've gotten a little bit past that now. It's kind of commonplace that that's been addressed, but sometimes you're still getting these questions. They're going to ask if you've done penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, and then they're going to want to know, have you identified your supply chain, both IT and non-IT vendors, right? Who are you dependent on? And a lot of that can dictate how your insurance coverage is going to respond.